The laughter burst through the polished air of the restaurant like shattered glass. Emma stood frozen, her notepad pressed against her chest as the man in the navy suit imitated her accent, twisting her words into ridicule. A few diners laughed, others looked away in uneasy amusement. The pianist stopped playing for a heartbeat, and behind them all, the CEO watched, expression unreadable. Her lips trembled, but she forced a small smile, one she had practiced too many times. "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered, the vowels soft, foreign, fragile. The laughter deepened, echoing against the chandeliers and marble walls. Emma's eyes darted toward the exit, but her feet stayed still. Her pulse was loud enough to drown the music that had resumed. The man raised his glass, still chuckling, as if her accent were a party trick made for his entertainment. "Say it again," he grinned. The other executives joined in, their laughter rippling across the tablecloths like a cruel applause. Emma's hands tightened around her notepad until her knuckles turned white. The sound of their joy burned hotter than the shame in her throat. No one came to her defense. Not the hostess, not her fellow waiters. The restaurant had rules. The client was always right, even when he was cruel. Emma's reflection in a silver platter caught her eye, her face pale, eyes glistening. She took one careful breath, the kind that held back tears and pride all at once. Then she turned slightly, ready to walk away. But before she could move, a calm voice interrupted. "Enough." It wasn't loud, but it carried authority that silenced the entire room. The laughter died, replaced by an uncertain quiet. The CEO stood at the far end of the table, his grey suit pristine, his gaze fixed on Emma. She dared not look directly at him, afraid her face would betray everything she felt. He didn't smile, didn't frown, only observed, like a man who saw more than he allowed others to notice. "You can continue your work, miss," he said softly, yet his tone carried something protective, something final. Emma nodded quickly, clutching her notepad like a shield, her heart racing from the sudden shift in power. The room remained still. As she stepped back, her steps careful and small, the hum of conversation returned, weaker now, ashamed. The man who had mocked her lowered his gaze, swirling the wine in his glass without drinking it. Emma moved toward the counter, her hands shaking, her throat burning with words she would never dare to say aloud. The air smelled of roast lamb and quiet humiliation. Inside her chest a storm brewed, a storm of shame, anger, and the faintest thread of defiance. She knew the sound of mockery too well. It had followed her across oceans. Yet in that silence left by the CEO's command, she felt something unexpected, a flicker of being seen, not as a joke, but as a person. For the first time that night, she let herself breathe fully. She leaned against the counter, eyes on the elegant dining room bathed in gold light. Every sound was sharper now, the clink of silverware, the soft hum of a violin, the shallow laughter of people pretending to be kind. She swallowed the ache in her throat and whispered to herself, "One day they'll listen differently." The words came out small, but steady. At the far end of the room, the CEO's gaze lingered a moment longer before turning away. Emma didn't notice. She was too busy steadying her breath, too busy hiding her pain behind the practiced grace of someone who could not afford to break. Yet somewhere, beneath the layers of restraint and fatigue, something had shifted, something that would soon demand to be heard. The laughter had long faded, but it lingered in her mind like smoke that refused to clear. Emma walked quickly through the narrow corridor behind the dining hall, her heels clicking against the tiles, her chest heavy with unspent tears. The golden lights of the restaurant dimmed behind her, replaced by the pale hum of the kitchen's fluorescent lamps. Every sound, every clang, every voice felt too sharp, too loud. She stopped in front of the mirror above the staff sink. Her reflection stared back, red-eyed, trembling yet stubbornly upright. "You're fine," she whispered, though she knew she wasn't. Her accent softened the words, wrapping pain in melody. She ran a damp cloth over her cheeks, as if wiping away the memory itself could erase the sting of their laughter. From the dining room, faint music returned, a piano playing something gentle, almost apologetic. She listened for a moment, closing her eyes. The melody reminded her of home, of the small kitchen where her mother used to hum while cooking, where laughter had been kind, not cruel. Emma exhaled slowly, letting the memory soothe the ache, if only for a breath. Her co-worker passed by, carrying a tray of empty glasses. He didn't look at her, didn't say anything. That silence hurt more than words. In this place, humiliation was contagious. People avoided it like disease. Emma understood. She would have done the same once, but knowing didn't make it easier. She felt like a ghost, haunting her own body. She sat for a moment on a wooden stool, hands folded tightly in her lap. Her throat still burned, her palms were damp. Why does kindness feel like weakness here? She thought, staring at the cracked tile near her shoe. She wanted to scream, but instead she straightened her back, forcing herself to breathe as evenly as possible. Dignity had to be quiet, she reminded herself. The clock above the sink ticked loudly, marking the minutes between humiliation and resolve. Every tick felt like a heartbeat, slow, deliberate, alive. Emma stood again, retying her apron, smoothing her vest, rebuilding the fragile armor that service demanded. She had learned long ago that strength wasn't loud. It was the silence that refused to break. As she stepped back toward the dining hall, she passed by the open door of the storage room. From within, a soft tune drifted, someone humming. She paused, recognizing the rhythm. It was an old folk song from her village, the same she had sung as a child while hanging clothes under the sun. Her lips moved without thinking, following the melody in a whisper. Her voice, small and uncertain, floated through the corridor, barely audible. Yet even in that whisper there was beauty, a raw, trembling honesty that no accent could hide. For a brief moment, she felt herself again, not a stranger serving tables, but a soul that remembered who she was. Then footsteps approached, and she stopped, startled. The kitchen door swung open. The manager's voice called sharply, "Emma, back to your tables." She nodded quickly, her heart jolting back to reality. The softness vanished, replaced by routine, by duty. She straightened her uniform, forcing the calm back into her breathing, but deep inside, a spark remained, fragile, secret, alive. When she returned to the dining room, the world looked the same, but she did not. The air was still heavy, the guests still chatting, the chandeliers still glittering. Yet beneath her quiet smile, something in her had begun to harden into purpose. The laughter had wounded her, yes, but it had also awakened something she could not yet name. The city was still asleep when Emma woke, the sky just beginning to pale. The silence of dawn reminded her of home, a faraway village with soft winds and the smell of bread rising from her mother's oven. For a moment, lying in her small apartment, she could almost believe she was there again. But then the hum of traffic below returned, and the illusion dissolved into the hum of reality. She rose quietly, making coffee on a stove that coughed more than it boiled. The cup was chipped, the floor cold, yet she smiled. These small imperfections made the place hers. On the wall hung a faded photo, her mother holding her as a child, both laughing, their eyes bright. "You're brave," her mother had written on the back years ago. Emma touched the words gently, like a promise. Back then, music filled her life like air. Her mother had sung through every hardship, harvests that failed, winters that froze their hands. When the world grew heavy, her mother would sing louder. "Songs carry light farther than money," she used to say. Emma had believed her. Even now, when loneliness pressed close, she hummed to remember the warmth of that voice. It was music that had first taught her English. Late nights by the radio, listening to old records, repeating the words she barely understood. Sometimes she would laugh at her own pronunciation. Sometimes she would cry, feeling the distance in every syllable. But she never stopped. Music made the foreign words feel human, as if belonging was possible after all. When she first arrived in America, she thought kindness was the universal language. She learned otherwise quickly. Smiles were polite but distant, and people spoke too fast to notice how hard she tried to keep up. Still, she worked, washing dishes, folding napkins, serving tables. Each paycheck was a victory, each kind word a rare treasure. She survived by quiet grace. One afternoon, months before the laughter that broke her, she had sung while cleaning the dining hall. Just a soft tune, an old lullaby. She didn't know anyone was listening until the bartender applauded quietly from behind the counter. "You've got a gift, Emma," he said. She had blushed and laughed. That night she almost believed she belonged there, but belonging, she'd learned, was a fragile thing. The more she tried to sound like them, the more her voice betrayed her roots. Some guests smiled at her accent, others mocked it. The cruelest ones did it as if it was sport. Still, Emma smiled through it, whispering to herself, "They don't mean harm." Yet each laugh left a bruise that words couldn't mend. Now, after the humiliation, those small moments of kindness felt distant. She replayed them in her mind while sipping cold coffee, wondering when the world had turned from promise to test. Still, she pressed on. Her shift began in 2 hours, and there was no room for broken hearts in customer service. The uniform demanded perfection, or at least the illusion of it. As she brushed her hair and tied it back neatly, she hummed again. The song came uninvited, the same her mother once sang under the olive trees. The sound filled the narrow room, echoing softly off the bare walls. For a moment, the ache inside her chest eased, and her reflection seemed to stand taller, steadier. She whispered, "You'll make her proud." Before leaving, she placed the photo of her mother beside the small plant on the windowsill. The city outside was waking now, its chaos ready to swallow her calm. Emma adjusted her vest, tied her apron with precision, and stepped into the morning light. She didn't know it yet, but this quiet resolve would soon be tested in ways that would break her, and then rebuild her. The restaurant shimmered under the soft glow of evening chandeliers. Emma moved between tables with practiced grace, balancing plates and polite smiles, her steps silent against the marble floor. The scent of roasted herbs and perfume mingled in the air, a tapestry of wealth she could never quite belong to. Tonight, the atmosphere buzzed, a table reserved for important guests, everyone on alert. She didn't know their names, only that the manager had said, "They pay our salaries." The servers whispered nervously, adjusting their uniforms twice over. Emma kept her focus steady, though her pulse betrayed her. She wasn't afraid of serving them. She was afraid of the laughter that might return. The memory of that night still lived behind her ribs, unhealed and waiting. As the doors opened, the group arrived. Sharp suits, polished shoes, laughter too confident to be kind. At their center walked the CEO, calm, composed, his presence commanding without words. Emma recognized him instantly. He had been there the night of her humiliation. Their eyes met briefly, just long enough for her breath to falter. Then she looked away, pretending not to notice. "Table 7, the manager whispered. "Make no mistakes tonight." Emma nodded and approached with quiet precision. The CEO's assistant spoke in low tones, arranging files and phones beside their plates. When Emma poured his wine, her hand shook slightly. Not from fear, but from the weight of being seen again by the one who had once silenced cruelty with a single word. He thanked her politely, his tone even, distant, but there was something in his gaze, curiosity, maybe recognition. Emma could feel it, the same way one feels sunlight through glass. She retreated a few steps, uncertain whether to be grateful or unsettled. Power, she realized, didn't always shout. Sometimes it simply looked at you and waited. The dinner stretched on, each moment blurring into routine. The executives laughed about numbers and deals, their words flowing like a language Emma would never learn. Still, the CEO remained quieter than the rest, listening more than speaking. Once, when a joke turned sharp at her expense, his eyes flicked toward the offender, and the laughter died mid-breath. It was the smallest gesture, yet it changed the rhythm of the room. Emma noticed. Everyone did. From that point on, the tone shifted, the men's arrogance tempered by invisible caution. She continued her work, heart steadying with each tray she carried. There was no kindness in the air, but there was order, and sometimes that was enough. As the evening waned, the CEO's attention lingered again as she refilled a glass. "You've been here long?" he asked quietly. His voice was low, unthreatening. Emma hesitated, unsure if she should answer. "Almost a year," she said softly, careful with each word. "You do your work well," he replied simply, then returned to his meal. The words were plain, but they carried warmth she hadn't felt in weeks. When the dinner ended, the executives left in a flurry of coats and laughter. Only the CEO lingered a moment, standing near the piano. He glanced once toward the kitchen, where Emma was collecting trays. Then he turned to the manager and said something she couldn't hear, only catching the end. "Next time, I'll ask for her." The words struck her like a pulse of light through darkness. Later that night, as she wiped down the final table, Emma's reflection shimmered in the glass window. Outside, the city lights trembled in puddles from a fresh rain. She didn't know why, but she smiled. A real one this time. For the first time in months, she felt that perhaps the world wasn't entirely blind to quiet souls. Somewhere above the hum of traffic, destiny had begun to listen. The morning light filtered softly through the restaurant's tall windows, painting thin gold lines across the tables. Emma arrived early, as always, carrying her small bag and that same quiet resolve. The air still smelled of polish and citrus, the calm before the crowd. She straightened napkins, aligned forks, and told herself today would be peaceful. Maybe even kind. The memory of the CEO's words still echoed faintly in her mind. "You do your work well." Simple, ordinary, yet they had anchored her through a long, lonely week. For once, she felt noticed for more than her mistakes. She hummed under her breath as she worked, a small tune that no one else could hear, something between prayer and defiance. Her heart dared to lift a little. By noon, the restaurant filled again, familiar faces, loud voices, endless orders. And then, like a shadow slipping through sunlight, the same group of executives entered. The man in the navy suit led them, his confidence unshaken, his smirk already waiting. Emma's stomach tightened. She forced a steady breath, determined not to let fear show. Today, she would not break. They didn't notice her at first, but when she stepped forward with a tray, the man's grin widened. "Oh, it's you again," he said, dragging out the vowels in mock politeness. The others chuckled, testing the room's limits. Emma smiled faintly, pretending not to hear. She set the plates down carefully, eyes lowered, every gesture precise. Her silence, she hoped, would be stronger than their cruelty. But silence, she was learning, sometimes invites cruelty to speak louder. "Say it again," the man teased, leaning back in his chair. "The word 'sir,' the way you say it is adorable." The laughter returned, sharper now. Emma froze, gripping the edge of the tray. Behind her, another waiter tried not to laugh, but failed. The sound pierced deeper than she expected. For a moment she wanted to vanish, to fade into the tablecloth, the walls, the marble floor. Her throat burned, but she held the tears hostage. She lifted her chin slightly, found her voice and said, "Enjoy your meal, sir." Her tone was calm, her accent unapologetically hers. Then she turned and walked away, her back straight though her heart trembled like glass. At the counter, her hands shook as she poured water into another glass. Her co-worker, Jason, whispered, "Ignore them, Emma. They're drunk on themselves." She nodded without replying, but her jaw tightened. Ignoring was survival, but it also meant swallowing pieces of herself she could never get back. For the first time, she wondered if silence was truly noble, or just another wound. Later, as she passed by their table again, one of the men muttered, "Shouldn't someone teach her to talk properly?" The manager laughed softly, the kind of laugh that agreed without saying so. That broke something small but vital inside her. She kept walking, even as her eyes blurred. Respect, she realized, was not something she could earn. Not here, not yet. From across the room, the CEO entered, unannounced, unseen by most. He took his usual seat in the corner, reviewing papers, occasionally glancing up. Emma didn't notice at first, lost in the rhythm of her own restraint. But when her gaze finally met his, just for a heartbeat, the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade. Something in his eyes said he had seen everything, and that changed the air. When the day finally ended, Emma lingered long after closing. The laughter had long gone, but its echo still clung to the walls. She sat at a table in the dark, the city lights trembling outside, her reflection faint in the window. The compliment from before now felt distant, replaced by the dull ache of disillusion. She whispered to herself, "Kindness shouldn't have to hurt this much." The restaurant slept. Tables gleamed under dim night lights, silverware lined like soldiers awaiting dawn. Emma stayed behind after closing, her reflection faint in the wide front window. She wiped the last glass slowly, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, the heartbeat of solitude. This was her favorite hour, when the world stopped demanding and finally let her breathe. She placed the glass down and exhaled, her breath fogging the window for a second before vanishing. On the counter, someone had left the kitchen radio on, the music soft and low, a lonely piano melody, half drowned in static. Without thinking, she began to hum along. The sound came small at first, fragile, uncertain, but with each note it grew warmer, fuller, alive. Her voice rose, wrapping the empty room in something gentle yet powerful. The melody drifted through the still air, blending with the smell of lemon cleaner and old wood. It was a song from her childhood, one her mother used to sing while washing clothes by the river. Emma didn't plan to remember it. It simply returned, like a forgotten prayer. And for a moment, she felt free. Unseen, the back door opened quietly. A figure paused in the doorway, listening. The CEO had returned to retrieve a forgotten briefcase. But as he stepped inside, the sound froze him in place. Emma's voice, pure, unguarded, unashamed, filled the space with something that didn't belong to any language. It carried sorrow, hope, and pride all at once. He didn't move. He simply listened. Emma finished the song softly, her last note trembling like candlelight before fading. She smiled faintly, unaware she had an audience. Then, hearing footsteps behind her, she startled, turning quickly. The CEO stood there, expression unreadable, briefcase in hand. I didn't know anyone was here," she stammered. Her cheeks flushed as silence stretched between them. He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Neither did I," he replied. His voice was calm, steady, yet carried an undercurrent she couldn't name. "That song, it's not English, is it?" She shook her head. "It's from my home." He nodded slowly, as if memorizing the sound. "Beautiful," he said simply, then picked up his briefcase and left as quietly as he'd come. For several seconds, Emma stood still, unsure whether to be embarrassed or grateful. Her heart pounded, her thoughts scattered like leaves in wind. She walked to the counter, pressed both hands against it, and exhaled. The air still carried the echo of her own song, but now it felt different, stronger, like proof that something inside her had survived the laughter. Later that night, she wrote a short note in her journal, a habit she rarely kept. "He heard me sing. Maybe that's enough for now." It wasn't confidence, not yet, but it was something close, the faint warmth of being seen, not for how she spoke, but for what her voice carried. Pride, she realized, didn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refused to disappear. As she turned off the lights and stepped outside, the city greeted her with soft rain. Each drop glimmered under the street lamps, like small blessings falling from the sky. She walked slowly, her reflection following in puddles. The tune returned to her lips, quiet and certain. Somewhere deep down, she understood. Silence could be broken, not by anger but by song. When she reached her small apartment, the world felt different, lighter somehow. The same photo of her mother waited by the window, smiling through the years. Emma touched the glass and whispered, "He heard me." Her voice carried no pride, only gratitude, the humble kind that follows courage. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, as if the sky itself were applauding softly. The night of the gala arrived, dressed in gold and tension. The restaurant glittered like a jewel box, flowers on every table, silver polished to a mirror's shine. Emma stood near the kitchen doors, adjusting her apron, feeling the hum of nerves in her chest. The air buzzed with chatter, champagne, and the low murmur of ambition. Tonight, nothing could go wrong. That's what the manager said. Twice. She moved carefully, invisible yet essential, weaving between tuxedos and silk dresses. The same executives were there again, their laughter already too loud, too careless. The CEO sat among them, calm as ever, his attention divided between conversation and quiet observation. Emma tried not to look at him. She just wanted to finish her shift, go home, and forget the weight of other people's opinions. When she served the table, she could feel their eyes, the kind that didn't see you, only the version they wanted to mock. "Ah, our favorite waitress," said the man in the navy suit. His voice was dripping with false charm. "Still singing in the kitchen, darling?" The others chuckled, glancing toward the CEO, as if daring him to intervene. He didn't. Not yet. Emma smiled faintly, but her fingers trembled as she set down the plates. "Enjoy your evening, sir," she said softly. The vowels betrayed her again, music wrapped in vulnerability. The laughter came instantly, spreading across the table like wildfire. One of them mimicked her tone, another clapped as if it were a performance. The sound burned through her like acid. For a moment, she froze. The whole restaurant seemed to tilt. Conversations slowed, forks paused mid-air. Even the pianist faltered on a note. Emma's breath quickened, her vision narrowing to the table, the faces, the cruel smirks. Something in her chest cracked, a fragile wall finally giving way. She had swallowed her pride for too long, and now it demanded to be heard. Her hand shook as she reached for the water jug. The glass slipped, shattering on the marble floor. The sound pierced the silence like a scream. Everyone turned. The laughter stopped. Water spread like silver tears across the floor, soaking the hem of her skirt. Emma stared at the shards, her reflection broken into pieces. One for every time she'd pretended she was fine. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but her voice trembled too much to sound like apology. The manager rushed forward, hissing, "Emma, you're embarrassing us!" His words struck harder than the laughter. She tried to kneel to clean up the glass, but her knees refused to bend. Her throat ached, her eyes burned. She felt the world watching, waiting to see if she'd shatter completely. The executive smirked again, leaning back with cruel amusement. "Careful," he said loudly. "Accents and glass, both fragile." A few gasps scattered through the crowd, followed by the uneasy shuffle of people pretending not to notice. Emma closed her eyes. She didn't cry, she didn't speak. She simply stood there, trembling under the weight of every cruel moment that had brought her here. Then a chair scraped sharply against the floor. The CEO rose. The sound cut through the silence like thunder after stillness. Every head turned toward him. He didn't look at the executives, he looked only at Emma. His face was calm, but his eyes carried something fierce, unspoken. The entire room waited for his words, for judgment, for rescue, for truth. He stepped closer, his voice steady yet soft. "Enough," he said again, the same word that had once silenced laughter. This time it was heavier, sharper. He glanced at the broken glass, then back at Emma. "Leave this to me," he told the manager quietly. Emma couldn't move. Her breath caught as he turned to her and said something only she could hear. "Don't bow your head anymore." The rain began before she even stepped outside, heavy, cold, relentless, like the sky had been holding back its own tears until now. Emma walked without an umbrella, the night swallowing her small figure as she turned down the empty street. Her uniform clung to her skin, her hair plastered against her face. The city lights blurred through water and exhaustion. Every drop sounded like another word she couldn't say. Her shoes clicked weakly on the pavement, echoing between darkened buildings. She didn't care where she was going, anywhere but back there. The laughter, the broken glass, the pitying stares replayed in her mind like cruel music. Each memory stung sharper than the rain. "Don't bow your head anymore," the CEO had said. But she had. She had bowed to everyone to survive. She stopped at a crosswalk, watching cars glide through puddles. The reflections of headlights looked like ghosts passing over her feet. For a moment, she wondered if anyone had ever felt this invisible, so small in a city that never noticed kindness unless it could be sold. Her throat tightened and she whispered into the rain, "Maybe I don't belong here." The words vanished before reaching her own ears. The night wind bit at her hands. She pulled her jacket tighter, but nothing could warm the ache inside. Every face she'd served flashed before her, polite smiles, cruel laughter, indifferent glances. All the effort, all the silence, and for what? Respect had always been conditional. Kindness always borrowed. Her heart was a bruise the world kept pressing against. By the time she reached the small park near her apartment, the rain had softened into drizzle. She sat on a bench, the wood slick and cold, and closed her eyes. The air smelled of wet earth and loneliness. "Mama," she murmured, "I tried." Her voice cracked like an old record. She remembered her mother's hands, always busy, always gentle. "You're brave," the letter had said, but bravery had never felt this empty. A soft sound drifted through the park, faint at first like a whisper through fog. Music. She lifted her head. Somewhere nearby, under the shelter of a church porch, a melody floated, low, steady, familiar. A choir was rehearsing. The tune slipped through the rain, carrying words she couldn't fully hear but somehow understood. It was her language, her people's song. Emma rose slowly, following the sound like a moth chasing light. The church doors were open, golden light spilling onto the steps. Inside, a handful of people sang softly, their voices weaving harmony into the night. She stood in the doorway, soaked and shivering, unable to cross the threshold. Then one of the women turned and smiled at her, not with curiosity but with recognition. The woman beckoned her closer. Emma hesitated, then stepped inside. Warmth wrapped around her like a blanket. Candles flickered, wood creaked. The air smelled faintly of wax and rain. The music swelled, and she knew the song completely now. It was one her mother had sung at home during storms, the melody of hope hidden inside despair. She joined in, her voice trembling but true. For a while, she forgot everything. The laughter, the shame, even her loneliness. Her voice blended with the others, fragile yet steady, and the pain began to dissolve into something softer. When the song ended, an old woman approached her, eyes bright with kindness. She touched Emma's arm and said, "Don't hide what God gave you, child." The words sank deep, like seeds finding soil. When Emma stepped back into the rain, it no longer felt cold. The city was still the same, grey, unforgiving, but she was not. Her steps were slower, deliberate. The song still echoed inside her, a quiet defiance wrapped in melody. She looked up once toward the cloudy sky and whispered, Maybe I'll try one more time." The rain fell gently now, like applause from heaven. The morning after the storm arrived, soft and blue. Sunlight filtered through the curtains of Emma's small apartment, laying gentle stripes across the floor. The air smelled of rain and renewal, that quiet promise the world sometimes gives after breaking you. Emma sat by the window, a cup of coffee between her hands, watching the city breathe again. The night felt far away now, like a bad dream slowly losing its edge. Her uniform hung drying by the heater, its faint wrinkles the only proof of the chaos she'd survived. She should have felt defeated, but instead there was stillness, fragile, almost sacred. The words of the old woman from the church echoed in her mind, "Don't hide what God gave you." Emma repeated them under her breath, unsure if she was praying or remembering. Either way, they brought comfort. She opened the small notebook where she wrote her mother's letters and tucked inside a new page. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate. "I sang again, Mama. Not for them. For me. For you." She smiled faintly, tracing the ink with her fingertip. The pain in her chest was still there, but it no longer felt like something that owned her. It was simply part of the song she carried. Later that day, she returned to the church. The same warm voices greeted her, and this time she didn't hesitate at the door. The choir director, a kind man with tired eyes, asked if she wanted to join them. Emma blushed, then nodded. When she sang, her voice rose steady and clear, filling the chapel with something honest. For once, she wasn't hiding behind politeness or fear. She was just herself. After rehearsal, the choir lingered over tea and laughter. They asked about her accent, her country, her music, but no one mocked. They listened. The questions felt like open doors, not traps. "You should sing more often," one of them said. Emma smiled shyly. "I sing when no one's listening." The old woman from before touched her hand and whispered, "Then sing louder. Heaven listens first." That night, Emma walked home through streets washed clean by sunlight. The air smelled of coffee and wet stone. She stopped by the restaurant window, the place where she'd been broken just a night before. Inside, tables were being set again, the world pretending nothing had happened. Yet in the reflection of the glass, she saw a different woman, one standing taller, unafraid of her own voice. She closed her eyes and hummed softly. The melody from the church returned, wrapping around her like armor. For the first time, she didn't feel small. She felt like someone who had survived something important. Maybe the world hadn't changed, but she had. And that, she thought, might be enough for now. When she entered the restaurant for her next shift, whispers rippled among the staff. The manager barely looked at her, but the air had shifted. Even Jason, the co-worker who had once laughed awkwardly, offered a small nod. It wasn't apology, but it was acknowledgement. Emma smiled faintly and went to work. Her silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was strength choosing its moment. As the evening light faded, the familiar sound of heels clicked across the marble floor. The CEO had returned. The moment she saw him, her heart fluttered, not in fear, but in something like gratitude. He sat alone this time, reading, waiting. Emma hesitated before approaching, the faint trace of her melody still in her mind. She didn't know it yet, but destiny was circling back toward her. That night, as she cleared his table, he looked up and said, "You seem different." She paused, startled. "Maybe I am," she replied softly. He smiled, just enough to suggest he'd been waiting for that answer. The candle between them flickered, as if the air itself had held its breath. Somewhere deep inside, Emma felt a quiet certainty. Something beautiful was coming, and this time she wouldn't run from it. The afternoon sun spilled through the restaurant windows, scattering gold across the marble floors. Everything seemed ordinary. The soft hum of conversations, the clinking of glasses, the faint notes of the piano. Yet Emma felt an invisible current running beneath it all. The manager had told her earlier, "Table 5, special guests, be perfect." She didn't need to ask who it was. She already knew. When the CEO entered, the atmosphere shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The staff straightened their backs, the chatter dimmed. Emma caught sight of him as she arranged napkins, his calm presence, the quiet authority in his step. He wasn't like the others. He didn't perform power. He carried it gently, as though it belonged to him by nature. For the first time, she didn't feel fear. She felt seen. He took his seat at the same table, the one that had witnessed her humiliation weeks before. The same men arrived moments later, still laughing too loudly, their confidence intact. But something in Emma's heart had changed. The laughter no longer pierced. It simply echoed in the distance, like a memory she had already survived. She breathed deeply and stepped forward, tray steady in her hands. As she poured wine, one of the men noticed her and smirked. "Ah, she's still here." His tone carried the same cruelty as before, but weaker now, uncertain. Before Emma could respond, the CEO lifted his gaze, calm yet firm. "I asked for her," he said evenly. The room fell silent. The man's grin faltered. Emma froze for a moment, unsure whether to feel gratitude or disbelief. She nodded politely, retreating with practiced grace. But inside her chest, something fluttered like wings stirring for the first time. At the counter, she steadied herself, hands trembling, not from fear this time, but from the quiet recognition of justice taking shape. The pianist began to play softly, a melancholic tune that felt almost prophetic. The moment stretched, delicate as glass. From her corner, she could feel his eyes on her now and then. Not intrusive, but attentive, observing, understanding. When she passed by his table again, he said quietly, "I heard you sing once." The words stopped her breath. She turned slowly, eyes wide. "It was after closing. You didn't see me," he added with a faint smile, "but I heard you." The world seemed to tilt, time slowing around the confession. She didn't know what to say. 1,000 thoughts collided in her mind. Embarrassment, gratitude, disbelief. "I didn't know anyone was listening," she managed softly. "The best songs," he replied, "are sung when no one listens." His voice was calm, but his gaze carried warmth, almost reverence. Emma lowered her eyes, a tear threatening to escape, then smiled gently instead. When she returned to the kitchen, her co-workers whispered. "What did he say?" Jason asked quietly. Emma shook her head, smiling faintly. "Nothing important," she lied. But inside, her heart pulsed with a different rhythm, slow, strong, alive. For the first time, her accent didn't feel like something to hide. It felt like part of a story that someone had finally chosen to hear. As the evening went on, the tension in the room began to shift. The men who once mocked her now spoke cautiously, their laughter measured. The CEO's quiet authority reshaped the air, and Emma moved through it with grace she hadn't known she possessed. Every movement, every smile, carried the quiet dignity of someone who had stopped apologizing for existing. When the dinner ended, the CEO stood and turned toward her before leaving. "Miss Emma," he said, voice soft but firm, "I'd like you to serve at my table again next week." The request was simple, yet it echoed like a promise. Emma nodded, her voice caught in her throat. As he walked away, she glanced toward the empty table where her humiliation once lived, and this time it felt like victory. The evening glowed with quiet anticipation. The restaurant was filled, but the air felt different, charged with something unseen. Emma prepared the table with unusual care, aligning each fork as though the balance of her life depended on it. The manager hovered nearby, anxious. "The CEO is here again, with his partners. Don't speak too much," he muttered. Emma only nodded. Her silence was her armor and her language. When the guests arrived, the room seemed to lean toward their presence. The CEO walked in first, composed as ever, followed by the same executives who had once mocked her. Emma felt their laughter lingering in memory, but not in fear. She greeted them with calm dignity, her accent unwavering. She wasn't hiding anymore. Even her smallest words carried quiet pride now. Dinner began smoothly. Conversation flowed like polished silver, refined, empty, predictable. Then, somewhere between courses, the CEO leaned back and said softly, "It's too quiet tonight." The others chuckled politely. "Perhaps some music," one of them suggested. The pianist hesitated. Before he could play, the CEO's gaze turned toward Emma. "I heard you sing sometimes while cleaning," he said. "Would you sing now?" The room froze. Forks stopped mid-air. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Emma blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. "Sir?" she whispered. He smiled faintly. "Please." For a long moment, she stood motionless, her heart pounding loud enough to drown the murmurs around her. The same men who once mocked her now stared, uncertain. Every breath in the restaurant belonged to her. She set down her tray and clasped her trembling hands in front of her. The silence was suffocating. But beneath it, something began to stir. She closed her eyes. When she spoke again, her voice was not words but song, soft at first, fragile as a candle flame, then stronger, brighter, until the walls themselves seemed to hum with her. The melody from her homeland filled the room, carrying years of exile, longing, and grace. The music poured from her like confession and prayer intertwined. The chandeliers shimmered, the piano stood still, and even the city outside seemed to hush. Her accent, once mocked, became melody. Her difference became beauty. The CEO watched, motionless, his eyes glistening with something unspoken. Around him, even the cruelest men could not meet her gaze. When the final note faded, the silence that followed was sacred. No one moved. No one breathed. The sound lingered like perfume, clinging to every surface. Emma stood still, head bowed, not from shame, but from reverence. Then she lifted her eyes, calm, shining, and met the CEO's gaze. He nodded once, deeply, as if acknowledging something larger than gratitude. Across the table, the man in the navy suit swallowed hard, his smirk erased. He glanced at his colleagues, finding no laughter to follow him this time. The moment was too pure, too human to mock. The pianist wiped a tear from his cheek before anyone could notice. Emma stood alone at the center of it all, small, soaked in candlelight, yet commanding the silence like a queen. The CEO leaned toward his assistant, whispering something she couldn't hear. The assistant nodded and wrote quickly on a small notepad. Emma noticed but didn't question it. Her hands still trembled slightly, but not from fear, from the enormity of what had just happened. For the first time, her voice had filled the room that once broke her, and this time it had not been laughter that followed. As the applause finally rose, slow, reverent, real. Emma smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes only after surviving yourself. She bowed her head once, whispering a thank you in her mother's tongue. When she lifted her eyes again, the CEO was still watching, calm, proud, and planning something she could not yet imagine. Destiny, it seemed, had only just begun to sing. The echo of Emma's song still floated in the air, fragile yet unbroken. The applause had faded into a stunned quiet, the kind that only truth can create. The CEO remained seated for a long moment, his eyes on Emma, while the rest of the room struggled to remember how to breathe. Then, slowly, he rose. The scrape of his chair sounded like thunder. Every gaze followed him. He turned to face the table of executives, the same men who had once turned her accent into amusement. "Beautiful, wasn't it?" he said softly. The question carried no anger, only weight. No one answered. "That," he continued, "is the sound of courage. The sound of someone who works harder, feels deeper, and forgives faster than most of us ever will." His words fell like stones in still water. The man in the navy suit tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. "It was just enough," the CEO interrupted, calm but sharp. "You mocked her for the way she spoke when all she was doing was her job, with more dignity than your money can buy." The words hung heavy, echoing through the chandeliers. Around them, the diners listened in reverent silence. The laughter that once mocked her now bowed its head. Emma stood still, her hands clasped, unsure whether to cry or disappear. The CEO turned slightly toward her. "Miss Emma," he said gently, "you've reminded this room what respect sounds like." Her throat tightened, and she lowered her gaze, overwhelmed. The kindness in his voice wasn't pity. It was recognition, the kind that heals rather than wounds. Then he looked back at the men. "I built this company from nothing," he said, his tone deepening. "I worked as a dishwasher once. My English wasn't perfect either. I know what it's like to have your worth measured by your accent." The confession sent a quiet ripple through the crowd. Emma's eyes widened. The truth, spoken so calmly, felt like a bridge between their worlds. For the first time, the executives looked small, their wealth and arrogance stripped bare in the face of humility. The man who had mocked her shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet the CEO's eyes. "Apologize," the CEO said simply. The word carried no anger, only command. The man hesitated, then turned toward Emma. I'm sorry," he muttered. The apology was clumsy, but real. Emma nodded slightly, not out of vengeance, but out of grace. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice steady, calm. The air softened again. The pianist began to play quietly, a melody that rose like forgiveness itself. For the first time, the restaurant felt human, its luxury stripped of pride, its noise replaced by something sacred. It wasn't a dining hall anymore. It was a place of reckoning. The CEO glanced at the manager next. "You allowed this," he said evenly. The manager's face went pale. "You'll take a week off, unpaid, and when you return you'll treat every worker here as you treat me." The room stirred, surprised. But no one dared speak. Justice didn't need to shout tonight. It simply stood where humiliation once did, calm, composed, undeniable. As he prepared to leave, the CEO looked back at Emma one last time. "You reminded me," he said quietly, "why I built this company in the first place." She didn't know how to answer. Her heart ached with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. The men at the table stayed silent, staring into their plates. The sound of her song still lived between them, the truth they could no longer ignore. When the doors finally closed behind him, the restaurant seemed to exhale. Emma stood motionless for a long time, her reflection shimmering faintly in a nearby mirror. She didn't feel victorious, only lighter. as if the burden of silence had finally lifted from her shoulders. The sound of respect had been heard tonight, and it carried her name, but somewhere deep inside she sensed that destiny wasn't done yet. The next morning dawned quiet and silver. Emma woke early, her thoughts still echoing the words she had heard the night before. "You reminded me why I built this company." She lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, unsure if it had all truly happened. The applause, the silence, the apology, they seemed like fragments from someone else's dream, yet her heart knew it had been real. She prepared her coffee slowly, savoring the warmth between her palms. Outside, the world moved as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, but to Emma everything had shifted. The rain-soaked memories of humiliation had dried into something gentler, clarity. She understood now that her worth had never depended on perfect words. It had lived in her courage, waiting to be heard. When she arrived at the restaurant later that day, whispers followed her through the door. Some smiled softly, others avoided her eyes, unsure how to behave around someone who had just changed the air they breathed. The manager approached awkwardly, voice low. "He left this for you," he said, handing her an envelope. Inside was a note, short, handwritten. "Meet me at the office tomorrow. Bring your voice. J.R." Her heart skipped. She read the line again and again, tracing each letter with her thumb. Bring your voice. The words felt like an invitation and a command all at once. That night, she could hardly sleep. She paced her small apartment, rehearsing what she might say or sing, though she didn't even know why he wanted to see her. But somewhere deep down, she felt it. This was no reprimand. This was purpose calling. The next morning, she took the subway across the city, clutching the envelope like a talisman. The CEO's office was nothing like the restaurant, spacious, calm, lined with books and old records instead of crystal and silver. He greeted her with a kind smile, gesturing for her to sit. "I owe you an explanation," he said, "and perhaps an opportunity." His tone carried both weight and kindness. He told her his story, how he had arrived in America as a child, unable to speak English, mocked for his accent until he learned to hide it completely. "It took me years," he said softly, "to realize that in hiding my voice, I lost part of myself." He paused, looking at her. "You reminded me of that truth last night." Emma felt tears forming, but she kept still, listening with her whole heart. Then he stood, walked to a cabinet, and pulled out a thin folder. "I sponsor a music foundation," he said. "Scholarships for immigrants, for voices that deserve to be heard. I'd like you to be one of them." Emma blinked, speechless. "Music," she whispered. He nodded. "You don't belong behind a tray, Miss Emma. You belong in front of a stage." The words hit her like sunlight breaking through clouds. Her hand covered her mouth, her breath catching between disbelief and gratitude. "I don't know what to say," she managed. He smiled gently. "Then don't. Sing." The simplicity of it broke her. Tears slipped down her cheeks, quiet and sincere. She laughed softly through them, nodding. "I will," she whispered. "I will." For the first time, her voice trembled not from fear, but from joy too big to contain. Before she left, he said one last thing. "When you sing, remember this. The world needs your accent." She carried those words like a blessing all the way home. The city around her looked brighter, the air lighter. The same streets that once felt heavy now hummed with possibility. She had crossed the line between survival and purpose, and she knew there was no turning back. That night, as she stood by her window, her mother's photo glowing in the lamplight, Emma began to hum again. But this time, the song was not one of sadness. It was gratitude, quiet, strong, endless. Her reflection in the glass was no longer that of a waitress hiding her voice, but of a woman who had finally heard herself. And though the world outside was silent, She knew. It was listening. Weeks passed, and with them came a rhythm Emma had never known, one that belonged to music, not survival. She spent mornings rehearsing with the Foundation's instructors, her afternoons still serving at the restaurant until her scholarship began. Each day, her voice grew steadier, fuller, freer. The same accent once mocked now carried every note like a signature, impossible to erase, impossible to ignore. Word spread quietly. Patrons began to ask, "Is she the girl who sang for the CEO?" Some came back just to see her, to hear her hum softly while arranging tables. The manager treated her differently now, polite, cautious, even proud in his quiet way. Emma accepted it without resentment. Forgiveness, she had learned, was a softer kind of justice. It didn't erase the past, it simply stopped it from owning you. Her first public performance came sooner than she expected, the CEO's annual charity gala. The same hall that had once witnessed her humiliation was now her stage. She stood behind the curtain, trembling slightly as voices murmured in the distance. "You're ready," the organizer whispered. Emma nodded, her heart racing not with fear but with awe. Life, she realized, had brought her full circle. When the lights dimmed and her name was announced, the applause began, polite at first, then rising. She stepped forward, bathed in warm light. The crowd blurred into color and shadow. The piano began softly. Emma took a breath and began to sing. Her voice filled the space, smooth and radiant, carrying both ache and hope. The song was the same one from her homeland, but tonight it no longer sounded like longing, it sounded like home. The same executives who had once laughed sat among the audience, motionless, their eyes glistening. None dared to look away. Some lowered their heads, others wiped tears silently. The CEO watched from the front row, hands clasped, his gaze proud and distant, like a mentor seeing a promise fulfilled. The air in the hall shimmered with something larger than applause. It was forgiveness made visible. When the last note faded, the silence that followed felt holy. Then came the applause, not the kind that fills rooms, but the kind that fills hearts. Emma smiled through tears, bowing her head as the sound washed over her. She wasn't the waitress anymore. She was a voice, her mother's dream, her own courage, the living echo of every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. After the performance, people approached her with words of admiration, but none of them mattered as much as one familiar face. The man in the navy suit, the one who had first mocked her, stood awkwardly near the edge of the room. His hands fidgeted, his expression uncertain. When their eyes met, he stepped forward and said softly, "You were extraordinary." Emma smiled. "I know," she said gently. And it wasn't arrogance. It was truth finally spoken aloud. Later, she found the CEO near the stage. "You were right," she said. "The world did need my accent." He laughed quietly. "I only helped you hear it first." Their eyes met in quiet understanding. No promises, no grand speeches, only mutual respect, the kind that doesn't fade. He handed her an envelope with the Foundation's seal. "Your scholarship begins in the fall," he said. "Make the world listen." That night, back in her apartment, she opened a letter that had arrived from her mother's village. The handwriting was old and uneven, but the words were bright. "I heard you sang for them, my daughter. Now they know what I always knew. Your voice is your courage." Emma pressed the letter to her heart, tears falling freely. Outside, the city glittered like a stage awaiting its next song. She walked to the window and began to hum softly, the melody floating into the night air. It mingled with the sounds of the city, traffic, laughter, rain, until it all became one harmony. Emma smiled, her reflection warm in the glass. The world had hurt her, yes, but it had also listened. She had forgiven it. And in that forgiveness, she found the truest sound of all. peace. Months passed like pages turning in a gentle book. Autumn arrived, and with it a soft chill that carried promise instead of sorrow. Emma's days now began in a music studio instead of a restaurant. The mirror-lined walls reflected not the uniform of a waitress, but the steady poise of a singer finding her truth. Each note she sang felt like a prayer answered, one small victory over silence. Her classmates admired her accent, calling it the voice of story. At first she laughed shyly, still unaccustomed to praise, but soon she began to see what they meant. Her words carried history, a sound shaped by distance, by longing, by courage. The music teacher once told her, "People try their whole lives to sound authentic. You already do." That day, Emma walked home, smiling through tears. The restaurant still stood where it always had, gleaming on the corner under golden lights. Sometimes, on her way home, she would pass by and see new waitresses bustling between tables. One evening, she stopped outside, watching quietly. A young woman with an accent, soft and hesitant, spilled a drink, and laughter rippled across a table. Before Emma could even think, she stepped inside. The laughter stopped the moment she entered. People recognized her now. Her name had appeared in local papers. The waitress who sang for the CEO. She walked to the young woman, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and said, "It's okay." Then she turned to the table of guests and smiled. "We all start somewhere." Her tone wasn't sharp. It was kind, the kind that corrects without wounding. The silence that followed was respectful. Later that night, as she left, the new waitress ran after her. "Thank you," she said, breathless. "They were laughing at me." Emma smiled softly. "They used to laugh at me too," she replied, "but only until they listened." She gave the girl a small necklace, a silver pendant shaped like a note. "Keep singing," she whispered, "even when no one does." The girl nodded, tears in her eyes. Emma's life became a quiet bloom of goodness. She began teaching children at a small community center, kids from every corner of the world, each with their own accent, their own melody. "Your voice is your story," she told them. "Never trade it for someone else's." The lessons were simple, but the laughter was pure, the music honest. The room often echoed with songs of many languages woven together. The CEO visited once, quietly, standing by the door as the children sang. When the song ended, he applauded softly. "You kept your promise," he said. Emma smiled. "And you kept yours." They didn't need more words. Respect had built a bridge between them, strong, silent, eternal. Sometimes, she thought, the kindest endings are simply beginnings spoken in another tone. As seasons changed again, her name began appearing on posters, small concerts, charity events, community gatherings. She never sought fame, she sought truth. Every time she sang, she began the same way, with the song of her mother's voice, the same melody that had once saved her. The crowd never understood the words, but they always felt the meaning. Music, she had learned, doesn't need translation. One evening after a performance, Emma stood alone backstage, looking out at the empty chairs. She thought of the girl she had been, afraid, mocked, quiet, and felt no bitterness, only gratitude. "You made it," she whispered to her reflection. The sound of applause still echoed faintly from earlier, blending with the hum of city lights outside. It felt like the world was finally speaking her language. She stepped out into the night, her scarf fluttering in the wind. The city hummed softly, cars, laughter, footsteps, a familiar symphony of life. Emma closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. In that vast harmony, her voice felt small but essential, a note the world had once overlooked and now could never forget. She smiled, whispering, "Now everyone understands my accent. It's called courage." If this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption.